today we have an impressive panel of communications leaders. First, Abdul-Rehman Malik, who's an award-winning journalist, lecturer, and associate research scholar at the Yale Divinity School. And he's also the co-founder of the Caravanserai Collective, which is a consultancy that uses storytelling as really a powerful way of transformation in communities and civil society organizations. So it'd be great to see, your work on that. Bhumika Regmi is senior communications strategist and principal consultant, specializing in brand, fundraising, and social strategy. And you've, of course, been the leader as far as brand and marketing for the Malala Fund. So it'd be great to get your input on your work there and the success that you've had there. And then Grace Thuo, who's head of communications at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, and also previous communications lead at the International Finance Corporation. So you're a thought leader in social impact communications. I see a lot of your content, and it's really, really great to see. And you've also written a lot about storytelling and storytelling frameworks. So it'll be, so I really look forward to having that discussion with you as well. And finally, last but not least, Mehmet Erdogan, who's head of climate communications at UNDP. And so you lead communications for the UNDP's Climate Promise Initiative, with a focus on creative campaigns, human-centered storytelling, and as you said, real challenge as far as climate comms is concerned. And you also worked on campaigns like the Dear World Leaders initiatives at COP26 and COP27, which is, as we know, like a really busy time for climate communications. And so the challenge there of getting through to policymakers on such a busy time. So it'd be great to get your insight on that. So first, I'd like to welcome everyone. We now have 124 people joining. Thank you all for joining. We have people from around the world, from Europe, from Africa, and the US. So it's great to see really a high level, a high turnout. And so first of all, my first question is, what's for the panel, what is a great story that you've seen or worked on recently that really was impactful and, you'd like to share as far as a model that we could follow? Maybe start with Abdul-Rehman.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nicholas. So such an honor to be with you and my colleagues here this morning. Last summer, we were in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, working with a group of 16 interfaith and interreligious leaders who came from a variety of different confessional backgrounds: Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, Taoist. And, each one of these individuals was deeply engaged in work in their own context. And some of them had done work across contexts. And we had brought them together to really talk about and to experience, is probably the right word, storytelling, not merely as sharing narrative, but embodying those narratives. How do those narratives emerge in our work, in our actions, and how do we feel them in ourselves? And so it was really powerful. One of the main powerful things happened over the course of those 5 or 6 days. But we pair up our participants, and together they work on their stories of self, why they're called to do what they do. But then even more interestingly for us, they work on a story of us, what unites individuals and people from very disparate backgrounds and experiences. And, this involves really weaving story, finding those common threads, seeing and listening deeply so that you start to move from the me to the we. And then they find a creative way of presenting this. They present this to the rest of the group. And we had 2 remarkable individuals from 2 very, very different contexts. One from the Philippines, Southern Philippines. The other one from a Malay woman from Singapore. And both of them found common ground on their experiences of their mothers, and the way in which their experience with their moms, both of whom had passed away much too young, really, and how that experience of loss, of love deferred, had motivated them and driven them to do the incredible work that they do in their communities. And they wove that story together through a poem they wrote jointly and presented. And they called the poem "We Share the Same Mother." It was remarkable, and the room was in tears, and we were just we were not only moved, but again, what it showed me was the capacity that of sometimes we often talk about storytelling in a transactional way, in a way that is about achieving certain targets, certain kinds of engagement. All of those things are important. And none of that is really possible and transformative until it becomes something that you feel in your chest and you can observe in your body. And I think that only happens when we work deeply to weave narrative that speaks to our core values. And it was just a reminder that the process that we go through, especially with our participants and the organizations, individuals that we work for, the goal for us is never the outcome of numbers. We'll get there, or the engagement. We'll get there if the story means something. And the story only means something if it means something in our bodies and ourselves, and if it pricks something in our values.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So to center more on the emotion and humanity of it, and then as long as the message resonates, then it will get sort of the impact that you're looking for. Yeah. Great. Thanks, Bhumika.
Yeah, thanks, Nicholas. I completely agree on needing stories to be told, because those stories need to be told for the people whose stories those are, versus, uplifting stories for the sake of the organization. Having that narrative and that kind of angle from the get-go, that should be the framework, and that's how stories become resonant, because they're more authentic that way. And people, I think organizations sometimes don't realize how kind of perceptive audiences are, how much they can see through what is authentic and what is kind of constructed. So it's a really great example. An example that I'll share about is this video series that I worked on called Roll Call for Malala Fund. It's a video series of girls around the world sharing their stories, their achievements, goals, and even kind of the mundane parts of their lives in their own words. This is a really old piece of work. If anyone here any of the audience knows me already or knows this work, they're probably like, she's still talking about this. But I think that, it kind of shows the success of that series, that I can refer to it today and it doesn't feel dated. In fact, it feels more pertinent than ever, especially in the age of AI, like I was saying earlier, where there's such a desire for stories that are kind of indisputably human, that just cannot be replicated. And I'll explain what that means. So these were basically videos of girls from around the world that we work with in Brazil, that Malala Fund was working with in Brazil, Syria, Pakistan, Iraq, in Nigeria, and Afghanistan. And these are girls who were asked, we worked with them and helped them kind of film their own lives and talk to camera and kind of go about their normal days, recording what was important to them, what were also the mundane parts of their lives, just in the sense of girlhood, what was most important to them and what mattered to them in their day. And we worked very collaboratively with them to turn this into a video series for those girls. And and I think really the stories that tend to resonate most are the ones that kind of resist the expected framing, right? Like the strongest stories come when you're turning a narrative on its head and giving your audiences what they haven't seen or heard before. And so this project, what made it really impactful wasn't just kind of what the subject matter was, but that shift in authorship and ownership of a story.
Mm-hmm.
Audiences can really feel that difference, right? Between storytelling, like I was saying before, that's polished versus storytelling that feels lived in and authentic to the people that it's serving. And ultimately, stories should be told, like I was saying, for the people who are telling it, not for anybody else. And this was our way as a team to platform these young women who wanted their stories told in the way that they wanted to be heard. And so you can't get more authentic than that. I can never frame somebody else's story in the most authentic way. They're always going to do it better for themselves. And so that was kind of the framing that we chose to approach for this series. And it really reinforced, the success of it really enforced for me that, that we don't need kind of perfect curated storytelling. Actually, what people want is specificity and emotional honesty. And this series kind of really ended up getting great media coverage, and it won a Telly Award. The platform that we used to host the story assembly, which was a digital publication from Malala Fund, went on to win a Webby, and it really kind of helped us solidify our strategy for platforms down the line, like TikTok, that requires that kind of authenticity. And we've had a lot of success there. So not to harp on kind of the metrics, because I completely agree with Abdul-Rehman that it's not about being transactional or achieving something for the organization. It's about platforming people. But just to say that it really showed me personally the kind of resonance that authenticity can have. So yeah, that's an example, because I think people want to hear from people. They don't want to hear from organizations. That's the bottom line. And I think that's what this was able to achieve. So it's an example that I always think of. Thanks.
Yeah, and particularly, since the pandemic, this kind of user-generated content has become, something that is we've seen, the fact that it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be like a perfect video. And actually some of the videos or some of the content that works best is the one that is, like you said, authentic, a little bit raw, a little bit unpolished. So yeah, Grace.
Actually, I just want to build on what Bhumika has said. People want to listen to people. They want to read from people. They want that engagement, to see themselves in that. And I had an earlier example, but I'm just going to switch that out because of just what you said. I was just in Uganda last week, and ideally, this was just going to be a straightforward, we're having an exhibition. It's the first of its kind, an exhibition specifically for nutritious foods. We have vendors who are coming in, and they'll be talking about their nutritious foods, very straightforward. However, when I got there and we sat down and, everything is going on, moving away from the cameras and the microphones and what have you, and the vendors had an opportunity to actually speak about their products and why they're getting into manufacturing nutritious foods. It wasn't about, I am using millet flour for ABCD. It was because I struggled with ABCD. This particular health challenge that I had, and that is why this is important. My baby had this particular challenge, and that is why this is important. So here you are in a room of 180 exhibitors, and suddenly it's like light bulbs are just going across the room. Like, yes, I get it, because I also had this, I also had that, and that is why I'm on this journey, and I want other people to know about it. So they had an opportunity to pitch. It was the first time for many of them who were actually pitching their product outside. This is a product that I'm selling. But they were able to talk about their origin story in such an authentic way. I mean, it just got us to just first sit down and listen and really interact with them and understand where they're coming from, and the passion and the zeal to keep going, irrespective of whether, they're far from markets or there are all these barriers, entry barriers, or whatever that looks like. And it got me just thinking, this is it. This is stories. These are cutting across different locations, geographies, but they're all put together in this room by stories and able to say, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. And so it's just stopped being an expo. It stopped being, well, we're just coming together to put together SMEs. It was like, wow, look at the stories that we're talking about here. This is why we're doing the work that we're doing. So it was it was, and some of the stories we're gonna be putting them out on our, all our platforms, but in just that space and in that just connection, I get, like you said, I'm a big proponent of stories, and I got it. I really felt that in my heart. So that for me really stood out as a recent one. Yeah.
Okay, congratulations. I mean, that sounds, great. It looks like a great way to turn sort of a corporate event into something that is really, more of the real conversations about really down to earth points of view of really the challenges, as opposed to this top level policy kind of discussion that we often get stuck into.
Absolutely.
Great. And then Mehmet.
Thank you, and great to hear from fellow panelists on kind of what's working for them. And I've also been a proponent of, user-generated content and personal storytelling for most of my life. But I think in my case, to broaden the discussion a little bit with climate change, I've found that that's not always the best way to go. I think what we found is with climate change, people want to know facts. They want to know that work is happening, progress is possible. And so the story that came to my mind when you asked this question, Nicholas, was a story we prepared and published last year on Jamaica and how Jamaica's future lies in green growth and climate resilience. That was the title of this story. It was more of a journalistic piece. And it really aimed to show like how Jamaica, first of all, is struggling with climate impacts, but then how it's taking leadership when it comes to climate action. So how is it scaling, renewable energy? How is it transforming its policies and its long-term strategies to tackle climate change? And there was a hopeful message in there, showing that progress is possible. It also, I think, directly uplifts the people who are on the front lines of climate change, who, most people might view perhaps as passive or constrained by resources and so on. And in fact, that's not true. The message that we were giving with this story was that these communities in the small island developing states, they in fact stand to lose first and most from climate change. And they're also the ones showing the way forward for the rest of the world. They're showing leadership. And, honestly, initially, like this story performed decently well. I would say as per average for us. But later, when the country was hit by another devastating hurricane, we just saw the interest in the story, surge. And this was for us an accident. Like, we just happened to have this story, and then Hurricane Melissa hit, and we saw the numbers for that story climb and the interest for that story grow. And we were glad to have told that story because people are here looking for, Jamaica climate change on search engines. And here we are with a story that, hopefully offers solutions and also progress and hope. And I think the lesson for us in that was, injecting yourself into the news cycle is important when you're telling stories. I mean, here we are talking about breaking through the noise. And I don't mean injecting yourself into the news cycle in like this manipulative way of, let me get more clicks and feed off on this disaster. It's more like, why am I telling this story? Why does it matter to the outside world? And what do they get out of it? Because as Bhumika earlier, I think, hinted at, people have a limited amount of time to spend on your content. Attentions are divided more than ever in so many directions. And the story you're telling has to be worth their time. So, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I absolutely. And I interviewed the communications director for UNEP, and he talked about, the importance of being agile, specifically to be able to respond, when there's an issue, when there's forest fires or something like that, to be able to tell the story. So to really have, already that capacity, and perhaps those stories already that you can unearth and maybe repurpose for a specific event that is happening. I think that's also a good idea. So one thing that I wanted to look at is, and looking at the poll was as well the challenge of aligning all of these great stories with strategic objectives, right? So as an organization, I've worked on, sometimes on stories where eventually you realize actually this story is not aligned or is not contributing to the narrative that we want to be aligned with. So I think that, this is a challenge that is, as organizations, we're constantly dealing with. So I wanted to perhaps start. I know that Grace, you've talked about this previously. You've written in the past, you've written, start with your audience. So understand their values, their questions, and their pain points. So can you talk a little bit about that, about how perhaps before trying to find a story, you look at basically what is the audience interested in, and how that relates with basically the important issues of the day.
So we have a simple framework that we use in my organization, which informs a lot of the work we do in comms, whether it is narrative building, content, talking points, messaging, call it. So it's simply why, how, and so what. And we have to start at the why. Why is this story important at this particular time? Why is this content piece against all the others? Why is it important at this particular time? Because then you'll be able to identify what is actually the pain point of the audience, and are we being able to meet that? And then also, why is this important for the organization? By that time, you've already looked at what the organizational objectives are, and so you're already able to align and see, okay, we clearly have our why. And then you can now move on to how. How are we putting this out? What are the, what is at hand? There are different limitations, nuances, context, whatever that looks like. How are we putting it out in the most authentic way, and in the way that is going to resonate with this particular audience that we want to speak to? And then to what end? So that we're addressing, so what? You put out the story, you've put out whatever you're putting out, then what? What do you want the audience to do? So that framework really helps us to pin down quite a bit of what it is that we work on, and gives us clarity in terms of, okay, we have a content calendar, and we've got all these other things that come alongside the planning of putting out content. But I firmly believe in starting at that point, and then you're able to identify who your audiences are and what will truly resonate with them as you are able. So that also it stops you from moving from trend to trend. It's very easy to see the latest thing and you're hopping onto it, and perhaps that's really not what your audience is there for. So it just keeps you very focused and helps as well, especially those who are going for so we put it in like a framework, and it's easily available, and we put our organization, the team, through the training of it, especially when it comes to the narrative, so that if you are going, say, for what's it called, a panel such as this, or some other kind of discussion, you can literally just already come and see, this is the broad messaging, I can get my why, my how, my so what, and it just pulls everything together. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think having that clear, but also having that clear beforehand is important. I've been in a situation where the team has started working on something and they spend like hours and hours and hours. And then after that, we get the story and it's like, well, actually, no, this isn't at all, what we were looking at. So I think having that ingrained and having that internally discussed so that everybody is aligned is also important. So that's a great framework. And actually, that aligns well with what Bhumika, you were doing at the Malala Fund with Assembly, which was, essentially this started as a newsletter and then it grew into something that was a co-creation with the girls and the community leaders that the Malala Fund works with. But having said that, I can understand that you were getting like hundreds of stories. It must have been challenging. How did you then work with them to make sure that all of these stories were aligned, or at least all of these stories were contributing to the narrative in a productive way, and not just basically just adding a bunch of stories that didn't have like a common thread?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think to respond to that, I would love to also touch on what what Mehmet was saying, and Grace. And it ultimately comes down to audience. Who is it that you're trying to speak to, right? Like Mehmet's example of climate it's a really good one, because you're absolutely right that climate is an issue where you have such a kind of divided audience that is really passionate about their viewpoint. You have an audience that really cares about it. There's an audience that doesn't think it's even an issue, right? And then you're going to have people you need to sway in the middle. And so facts and data is a really key part of climate storytelling, because you need to sway the audience who doesn't think this is even an issue, and make it clear to them, actually it is, and why does it matter to everybody, then you have to give that same information to the people who care so that they can sway the people in their lives. That's why I think like the numbers are so important. But the reason I'm touching on this is ultimately it comes down to who are the audiences that you're trying to influence, right? What is the purpose of anything that you're doing? It's to influence, and so who is that audience? And Grace, that's kind of what you're talking about, is knowing who your audiences are. So I think to answer your question, for us, Assembly worked really well as a tool, because for Malala Fund, the girls themselves were also a big part of our audience, right? The girls were a big part of our audience, so were policymakers, and a broader audience in terms of fundraising. And there's different tools you can utilize to influence those different audiences. Assembly was really a core tool to work with the girls themselves, to platform the girls because they are our audience, to get girls interested in the work that we're doing because they are our audience. And that's why it really worked. It might not be, if we start to then kind of, if once the organization shifts, let's say, to really focus in on policymakers being the key target audience, Assembly no longer doesn't have the same kind of value add, because the types of stories we're telling there, it could be useful in what you then do with those stories, to what end, like Grace was saying, what you then do with those stories to influence policymakers. But at that time when Assembly was formed, the purpose of Assembly was to reach girls themselves and platform girls themselves and create kind of this community of girls who care about education and are sharing their stories. So just to kind of, front load with that, I think in terms of kind of aligning storytelling with organizational goals, I don't think that storytelling should ever be kind of like sitting adjacent to strategy. I think it should be actively advancing it. In that, like, whether how storytelling fits within strategy comes at the point where you're building strategy. I think it shouldn't be an afterthought. The questions that really you should be asking your organizational leaders, like, let's say you have your 5-year strategy coming up, a new 5-year strategy, storytelling really should be integrated in that. And, you should be asking your ELT, what do we want as an organization, what do we want for people to feel about this organization when they come across this organization? What do we want them to feel? What do we want them to understand? What do we want them to do? And what's the end goal? What is the ultimate vision of this organization? Based on those answers, you build your storytelling strategy. And they're not always going to be straightforward, right? You will need to do a lot of deep work and align kind of really deeply at the organizational board level to come up with these answers. But ultimately, the answers to these is what forms your brand. It's not even just about storytelling. What do you want them to feel, understand, do? What's the end goal? This is what forms your entire brand. And your brand then informs your storytelling. So if you're at a point in your organization where the comms team is not aligned with kind of the larger executive leadership on what kind of stories you should be telling, the problem isn't with the stories, the problem isn't with the executive leadership, it's that there isn't alignment on what is the brand of your organization and what is it ultimately supposed to do. So then you might need to circle back to that, and your 5-year strategy that's coming up is a really good time to actually circle back to that conversation about what's the end goal, who are the audiences, maybe there's pockets of audiences, can there be segments of different types of stories that you can be telling. So for Malala Fund, let's say, Assembly can remain as the tool that we really kind of uplift to engage young women who are our audience, but then coming up with a strategy on, okay, if policymakers are our audience, how do we get that to be influential for that segment of audiences? That's deep work you have to do with your executive leadership. So all to say, it's never a adjacent thing. I think storytelling or anything that you're posting externally or talking about externally when it comes to your organization, it should all circle back to the same brand strategy. And that happens at an organizational level. It doesn't happen just with the communications team.
And I think Bhumika, to build on that, and what Grace and Mehmet have been saying as well, is that I think that's when we get into a situation where our storytelling becomes instrumentalized and starts to take on the form of tool, and actually becomes a way of kind of manipulation rather than influence, or rather than shifting the landscape. And I just want to raise what you said around weaving storytelling into organizational process and and culture. And I think there's a real pushback from especially from those people who are working in policy, those who who are, in places like that. That, well, where does storytelling belong? No, it's a nice add-on at the end of things. It's a nice thing to have, but it doesn't do the work of real policy conversations or strategy. And in our work, we've seen the exact opposite. I'll give you two quick examples. We were helping facilitate a high-level climate change, to speak to Mehmet's world, convening at a major foundation in DC. There were folks from civil society, from petrochemical industry, from government policy, all in the same room. And initially, the conveners of that gathering had said, well, we'll just quickly do introductions and move into the first panel. And we said, then we don't know why we're here helping you. He said, forget the introductions. Everyone can read a bio. Everyone has 2 minutes. There were 30 people around the table. Why the hell are you here? What brought you here? What is the thing that is driving you into this particular conversation and moment? And it was a North-South conversation on climate change. And what was really magical was that the first person to speak was a Brazilian activist who had worked from her teen years and now into adulthood in the Amazon with communities around climate justice. And she told this incredible story of meeting someone in her university year as a child in a particular community in the Amazon that was challenging, these kind of aggressive companies who were deforesting the Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. And she met that same young person, now a bit older, at a COP conference. And the story that emerged from that was like, oh, this is why I've been doing this for 20 years. That's why this matters, even against all the odds. And the amazing thing that happened was that once that opened up, then when we got to the petrochemical executive, the story was totally different. It's like, why am I working in issues around climate change when I'm working for, a $1 trillion company? It changed the mood of the room. But it also influenced the discussions that we had in the entire day that followed, because there was a sense that this is not something that is abstracted onto a policy or strategy document. It's something that is meaningful to those who are in the room. And I think it comes back to the thing that you were talking about, Mehmet, earlier, was this idea of recognition. That whatever the content is, we have to recognize something of ourselves, of our needs, of our concerns in it. And then it speaks to what you were saying, Grace, around influence, right? Whom are we influencing, and to what are we influencing? And I think this is where things get complicated. And Mehmet, you kind of really drove down into it. And we have climate deniers. We have those who are climate activists. We are those who are concerned. Is the same story going to reach each one in the same way? Sometimes, from a strategic point of view, our work is around shoring up the coalition of the willing who've already joined the fight, right? In other cases, it's how do we move the needle a little bit? And Grace, I really appreciate this framework that you have, because I think it's it's absolutely vital. Who needs to hear this? What do they currently believe? What needs to shift? And then, telling a story that is authentic and real and truthful and value driven, but knowing that that's going to hit different audiences in different ways.
Yeah, and the platforms you're using, right? So, like, to the point of assembly, completely agree with you that stories shouldn't just be instruments; they're vital to policy as well. But in the case of Malala, for example, if we only relied on assembly as a platform to make that influence on policymakers, it's not going to happen. It's unrealistic to think that that they're looking at assembly in that way. So my point was kind of around how do you then uplift those stories in a way that is, in a way or a platform that's actually going to be influential to the right people. And what you said about bringing stories, bringing people to the rooms where these conversations are happening is probably the most influential way to do that. and how important it is for organizations to stop centering themselves, really decentering themselves, and bringing the voices forward of the people you're actually serving, or the people that you're working with is really valuable. So I really appreciate that point.
Mm-hmm. And Abdul-Rehman, that's why you use, a lot of the Marshall Gantz approach, right? The story of self, story of us, and the story of now, to really start with the story of self, right? So that's kind of what you're saying as far as trying to steer away from these big picture kind of like numbers and stuff, and really bring it down to a personal level. Is that kind of like what
Truly, I mean,
the
the work of Marshall Gantz and public narrative, which all of us are familiar with, and I think what has been exciting about it for us is this framework of story of self, story of us, and story of now. Why am I called to do the work that I do? What unites you and I? What are the values that unite you and I in the work that we could potentially do together? And then what is the work that we do together? To us, at one level, it sounds simple, but I really do believe it's the DNA of movement building. And we have to be invested. We have to be invested in the thing that is going on in a personal, embodied, visceral way. We have to feel it and know it, and also be able to identify our lived experiences that contribute to that knowing, feeling, and then eventually doing. And for us, that certainly that public areas, as I'm sure for our colleagues who on this call, has been really a really important tool, and we've also found that it's a malleable tool, right? It's something that we can hack, and we can find different mechanics of telling those stories, and we can do those in a way that's relational, and we can do that in a way that again moves us from the me to the we.
Yeah, and Mehmet, you've obviously, on the climate change issue, you've done a lot of explainers as well. How are you kind of bridging that gap between the educational and the inspirational side of things?
Yeah, thanks so much, Nicholas. A great question. And first of all, let me just say that it's amazing to hear all the experience in the room on climate change storytelling, because this really is a defining crisis of our time, and I think we need everybody at the table. And so thank you all so much for all the work you do on this topic. Look, I think climate change is obviously a very technical topic. It is really complex. It is difficult to wrap your head around. It is also very depressing. Often when I'm asked what I do at a party, I say, let's go to a different question, because I feel like it's like the question that stops the party. If I start talking about communicating on climate change, there is an intellectual and emotional barrier when it comes to talking to people about climate change. I see with my own friends, I see with my family, like, their eyes start glazing over like 2 minutes in. And so as I said, I've been a proponent of human interest storytelling and user-generated content for all my life. And there was this assumption that if you tell emotional, personal stories of courage, of perseverance, that people will bond more strongly to your cause. At the same time, I don't know how much that always works for us on climate change, because it is an abstract concept. It takes place over a long time. The causes and effects are not as easy to pinpoint in daily life. So there is this very pervasive challenge when you're trying to communicate on this topic. And to make it more difficult too, most of the impacts are happening elsewhere. So it feels it's always happening in developing countries who don't have the resources or the economic system to withstand the impacts. So there is that empathy gap as well. And I feel like you are always walking a tightrope as a communicator on climate change, because your tone matters so much. It's hard to know how much is too much. If you go too negative, you're going to lose people, because they'll become despondent and hopeless. If you go too positive, then they're going to fall into a sense of complacency and think, well, I'm not needed here. I'll move on to the next thing. So it's like there's a very, very tightrope. And in light of all of that, so it's like, what is the answer then? If the human interest stories are like not fully getting us there, we decided to go a different route. And it was a bit of a risk in the beginning to convince our management or our team, but we decided to create explainers around different topics on climate change. So based on questions people are asking, and really people are asking on Google, for example. So every month we would pick a different topic on the wide range of work that we, represent, whether it's the role of gender equality in climate action, or the role of indigenous peoples, or what does it mean to do climate adaptation. And what we've seen is that these explainers get tens of thousands of views. Over the past 2.5 years, I think we've amassed about 1.5 million views in total. And we've also seen that these explainers helped position our brand on Google. In Google searches for many topics, we ended up showing like in the first 10 results, which then helped bring more people to our website. And then once we did get them to our website, then we were able to hopefully retain them to read our photo stories, read our more journalistic pieces, or thought leadership pieces. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is the title of this webinar is Social Impact Storytelling That Breaks Through the Noise. But we might also call it That Breaks Through the Sea of Misinformation. I mean, with the rise of AI, with the rise of kind of all the difficult social problems that we're having now too, what we're seeing is people really need like verified information. They need resources where they can go and they can take quotes and say, this is coming from a reputable source. And we said, maybe as the UN, maybe that's our value added. Maybe that's what we can give people, is more fact-checked, verified information. And that's why we went this explainer route, and I'm so glad that we did.
Yeah, definitely. So that's, I think, a key role. So one of the things that perhaps we can skip right to is from the poll, which was the biggest challenge, or one of the biggest challenges, which was stopping the scroll. So obviously, we could spend a lot of time writing amazing stories, producing it, then publishing it. But if no one reads it, then in the end, it's a waste of time. So it's a big challenge. And I was just speaking with a communications director on the topic, and he said he actually used employee advocacy. He got an employee to talk about her story, about the story that they wrote and why the story is important for her. And so really kind of meta, like a story about a story. But all to say is, I think we need to be creative about the way that we showcase our stories. So, what are some of the ways that you're basically stopping the scroll? I know, Mehmet, you have some ideas, or at least some experiences on that.
Sure. So I'll start. I mean, I think just continuing from that trend of explainers and verified information, we've managed to turn that into a few campaigns that we've seen had lasting impact. One of them was a climate dictionary. This is a fun idea or fun variation on a dictionary where you're defining climate terms. So we defined 52 terms on climate change and nature crisis, and we coupled these terms with, we gave it kind of like a dictionary look. The visuals were extremely important. I think when we're talking about stopping the scroll, the more current and modern your visual identity is, the better, because you're competing with so much out there that is top-notch, excellent content production. And some of us who work in the UN agencies or NGOs or CSOs, we don't always have the big budgets that some of these media agencies have. And yet you have to do what you can do to make sure that you are competing at that level and you're producing content at that level. So visuals are really important. Climate Dictionary was one where we define terms, and this has been translated to more than 10 languages and have gotten 200,000 views. So, and we still see it shared constantly on LinkedIn by people years later, which is great. Another one was Climate Counts. That was our campaign last year. We launched it in the run-up to COP30. And here we went the opposite. Instead of words, we went with numbers. So we took the numbers 1 to 30, and we told a story about each number and how it relates to climate change. So we use these as ways of giving people statistics. We thought of this campaign as more of a Trojan horse. Again, it's so hard to get people to even think about climate change. So let's use a fun or lighthearted vehicle to get these statistics to people's desktops, to their news feeds. And again, we illustrated like a colorful deck of cards, like a tarot card deck, my personal dream. And again, like having each card with a number and that corresponding statistic. So for us, again, that was translated to 5-6 languages, and it's been really successful as well. I'll stop there just to give my fellow panelists some time to talk as well. But those are 2 examples from me.
Cool. And Grace, what has been your experience with GAIN? Obviously, nutrition, global nutrition is a key issue. But how do you get that at the forefront, in this busy social media feed that we all have?
Absolutely. It's a big issue. Misinformation, disinformation, name it. It's huge. But we've definitely recognized some patterns. Employee advocacy, by the way, is a big one. People want to see the people behind the work, whether those are project participants, whether they are part of the organization, whoever is that is. So employee advocacy is a big one in terms of just moving the story. Short form video content, as opposed to the longer kind of structure. 2 minutes under, something easy, something fun, preferably non-scripted, that actually has a good retention and engagement. And then there's something else we've also been exploring, which my colleague recently just put as edugagement, just education and engagement. The trend where we've got, unbox with me, people are unboxing phones, whatever that looks like. So because GAIN is very evidence heavy, knowledge leadership in that space. And so unpacking that as unbox with GAIN. And so the technical specialist or whoever else is behind this report coming in and just giving two minutes max. Let's unbox this report. What is it about? Why is it important? What is the key information in this kind of whether report, brief, toolkit, whatever that looks like, and breaking it down in a way that gets out, removes the jargon. And that has been a really good way as well of getting people closer to the content, closer to the information, and engaging with it and understanding better what that looks like in terms of nutrition. As well, what Mehmet said about graphics, the strategic use of graphics. So if you're having a carousel, quizzes, polls, connecting that to something. So that is not just a quiz. It is, for example, we're going to connect it to a story, we're going to connect it to a report, we're going to connect it to our convening, whatever that looks like. So making sure there's that linkage so that even as somebody has put down the poll, then they have got that impetus to actually follow through reading whatever is put in on that link or something like that. And lastly, I would actually talk about collaborative content, just coming together with peers if there's an event or if there's something else that is happening. That cross-pollination of content is fantastic because then it really opens you up to wider audiences who are outside your regular reach, and that also gives really strong engagement. So it makes people then be able to pause in and really dig into the content that is all different ways that we've been playing around with it and getting some good results.
And Bhumika, you've written that the best storytelling often comes from resisting the obvious angle and staying open to turning things on its head. So what's the best way to turn things on their head?
Well, while I have said that, I will say actually that is an extremely important part of stopping the scroll or kind of being compelling. But actually, I think the bigger part of stopping the scroll is more boring than that, and it's discipline. And I know that's going to sound really strange, but I'll kind of try to explain what I mean. I think it's this idea of so storytelling and going viral, it all feels so buzzy, right? Like it just kind of happens. But virality is limited. You can do nothing and put something that just suddenly catches an audience and you get this overnight success on one piece of content. That's not sustainable. I think that in practice, it is actually much more, it's a result of really disciplined work in that you're doing constant research, finding the kind of stories that are going to resonate and feel true to your brand. You're constantly researching the algorithm and understanding what's changing. You're researching what is out there, what is already too tired, what is your competitive advantage, and what's the angle that you're adding to what the noise that's already out there, breaking through the noise. that takes research and really being completely present on these platforms to understand what works. So that's the boring part of it. It also takes relationship building, meaning stories don't come from thin air. I think one of the questions that that we had previously discussed, you and I, Nicholas, was how do you find these stories? How do you find good content? That takes a long period of kind of relationship building with the people whose stories you're telling or the issues, right? It takes relationship building with your audience as well. Have you done the work to kind of make your brand so recognizable over time that your content instantly, it sticks with people when you share it? So I think that's the kind of legwork that has to happen, that's boring, in order to get people to actually care about what you're doing and what you're sharing. If that's not happening, then you're getting a one-time success and it's not sustainable. So I will say, like, just to preface that, even like editorial rigor, right? Like, are you holding your standards really high, or are you just trying to like churn out volume and hope that you're getting success in that way? So these are some really kind of like specific decisions and legwork and discipline that you have to have ahead of time, I think. But other than that, in terms of turning stories on its head, I think, understanding what's working right now and always will work is you have to be platform native. I think that's the most important thing. Is if you are just putting out a video and not thinking about what works on that specific platform. Like, let's say what works on Instagram isn't going to work on TikTok. Instagram is a much more polished platform. TikTok is not. TikTok really requires that kind of user-generated raw feel and kind of an element of surprise almost, in a way that Instagram doesn't always require. So are you thinking more natively? And if you're not, then you're going to come across as an organization that's trying really hard to be interesting on TikTok without really understanding the platform very well. So I think that's important. But generally speaking, kind of human first short form videos work. Same things we've talked about before: conversational content, less polished, kind of emotionally immediate, urgent, resonant. A strong point of view, in that the internet doesn't reward neutrality. It rewards a point of view and having a perspective that's unique to your brand or to you. So what is the new angle or message that you're adding that's not neutral? Why should anyone care to stop and watch? If they've seen 10 of these kind of same perspectives, why will they stop to see? If you're sharing something really unique that people haven't really thought about before, this angle of like something has happened in the world or something important is happening, but no one's thinking about this one aspect. Are you talking about that one aspect that makes sense to your brand? That's important. I think seeing faces is important, as we've talked about a lot. And then this surprise element of surprise, kind of unexpected thing that you're doing. And that can come from things like, I think Grace was just saying about partnerships, unexpected partnerships that are still value aligned. Like if you see, let's say a climate entity doing a collab or a partnership with a brand that people just don't expect that to happen, but then they see it and they're like, this actually makes a lot of sense. And how interesting is that? That's the kind of, I think, element of surprise that really works right now as well. I think those are kind of broader concepts that I can think about, but helpful to hear examples from everybody else as well. Thanks.
Definitely. Go ahead,
I'll jump in. And Nicholas, I really appreciate the perspectives of Grace, Bhumika, and Mehmet. I do want to push back on something, Nicholas, that you said earlier. Engaging in the work of storytelling is never a waste, because the process of learning and going through the mechanics of doing it, even within organizations, where they may not turn into the kind of content that we want, is itself transformative. Because I think it comes back to what we were talking about before, about weaving storytelling into process, organizational culture, and our own narratives internally in terms of the work that we do. Because our contention, particularly in our work over the last sort of 10 years and beyond, has been, there are no stories without storytellers. So stories don't exist. We think that they exist in the ether. Someone's telling them, someone's pushing them, someone's investing in the algorithm, someone's designing them, right? Stories just don't exist out there. Someone's got to tell them. And so our contention is that if you're going to strengthen anyone in the process, strengthen the storyteller. you provide the storyteller with the tools, the mechanics, the values, the framework to tell their stories, and to tell them in a way that, of course, are not instrumental and not exploitative as so many international organizations do. And we know that, right? But the only way that that's possible if we're investing in the storyteller, and that we're taking the storyteller seriously, because we'll move them. We'll move the needle on their ability to do the great things that Grace, Bhumika, and Mehmet are talking about. I think the second challenge is, and I think we've all said it in our own ways, the second challenge is we're in a time of massive content generation. AI content generation is all around us. Sometimes even for us, I would say, it's difficult to tell something that's AI generated right on the edge of what is human generated. There's been times when I've been downright confused. I don't know if you guys have been, but I have. And I think that this is something that we got to not only pay attention to. Why does that matter? Yes, volume is not the goal, but the algorithm is fed by volume. The algorithm is fed by volume. It's fed by repeated material. It's fed by the by messaging certain values that are repeated over and over again, and then tailored to the individual who is watching them. Because the goal of the TikTok and the IGs is not to promote Mehmet's explainers on climate change. It's to get me to Temu or wherever else and buy the next piece of schlock that I need to order. And so what we are up against is actually a massive challenge, right? Larger organizations are ahead of the curve because they can invest. They have name recognition. What about the smaller organizations, the ones who are doing focused work, the ones who want to get their messages out? We're up against the AI challenge. We're up against the algorithm challenge. And frankly, let's just be frank about it. We're up against corporations, companies, businesses, entities who don't give a crap about the things that we care about. They don't care about nutrition. They don't care about women's rights. They don't care about climate change. That's not in their business plan. And so they're telling stories that are totally opposite to that. And so we're up against a lot here. That's why I think the lessons and the advice given in the last hour are so vital and so important, especially for those who are truly committed to social impact storytelling. And I want to come back to something you said earlier, Mehmet, because it really resonated with me. It's the incremental stuff. It's the playful stuff that's going to build the audience. And then how do we keep, as you were saying earlier, Grace, how do we hold on to that audience and grow it, right? How do we influence those individuals to advance, promote, amplify, share, reach out? That has got to be the concentric circle approach that I think we have to take in terms of the issues that we care about. And to me, it brings us back to the fundamental issues that all of us have been talking about, and I think we all believe in. That this question of authenticity is not an abstraction. It is about how do we feel the stories in ourselves? How do we see recognition? And where is their agency? Because we can take a step back, and I'll come back to what you said, Mehmet, because I again resonated with it. We take a step back and we look at the climate apocalypse that is upon us. It's not only depressing, it almost feels inexorable, doesn't it? How do we shift? How do we shift? And then how do we then think about the Malala funds, the global nutrition and food systems, the amazing work that UNDP and other organizations are doing to meet the catastrophes that are to come, right? And this often, I think, is a global North-South issue. It's a privilege issue. It's a power issue. It's a way that we move not only policy, but we move public opinion. So these are wicked problems. These are thorny problems. And I think, and I think when we think about storytelling for social impact, that's why it can never be like, we're here in the issue and the storytelling is there. Storytelling is the language. It's what we do all the time. It's just the way that we communicate. It's the most human thing that we do. So how can we move from the me to the we? How can, because people won't, like Muhammad Ali said again, people won't remember what we said, but they'll remember how we made them feel. And if remember how we made them feel, then how did we move that towards action? So those are the things that if there's something about this topic that keeps me up at night, it's that. Because actually the challenges are great. The wall is high. And all my three colleagues in particular, my proverbial hat off and appreciation for being really on the front lines of this in terms of policy, international organizations dealing with corporate and other governmental entities at a time when global politics is not on our side, right? It's not. Electoral politics is not on our side. And so this work is far more important. There's an urgency to this conversation that I just want to underscore from where I sit. This is urgent. And that's why all of these little things matter. And that's why doing the work of storytelling, to me, teaching storytelling, making it part of our processes in our lives naturally, so that when we come into a board of directors meeting, we start with a story circle. When we come into a board of directors meeting, let's do some theater of the oppressed. We've tried that. In Singapore, we brought all these policymakers together, from public safety and the Home Office and all these other places. And we said, hey, let's play a game first. And they all kind of looked at each other. And it was amazing the transformative element that those games and those stories have, if we're willing to lean into them. And if we're willing to push it a little bit. How different would our corporate environments look like if we had some of these things? I do think about that openly. Thank you for allowing me the soapbox.
No, absolutely. And I think, your challenge as well is trying to translate that energy that is in the room to a global audience. I think that's the challenge that we as communicators really have. And as you said, the algorithms and the social media and the whole the platforms certainly are not helping. So first, I see a lot of people dropping off because we're just past time. When people finish, they'll be invited if they want to register for the storytelling course waiting list. But I just wanted to finish with, I guess, one last word from everyone as far as what you took from this webinar. What are you going to try to implement? I think, what I've taken from what you said, Abdul-Rehman, is storytelling should be embedded in everything that we do. What are some of the, basically just in a few sentences for each of us, each of you, what are you taking from today's discussion that you're going to try to implement in your organization? Maybe start with Bhumika.
That's a really good question, and I don't know if I have an easy answer. But I'm going to say, maybe this is controversial, but I think easy wins are not wins, I think is an important. What I mean by that is, it's easy to, let's say, tell a piece of story about your organization having attended an event because you want more content out there and you want to acknowledge that you've done something. That's an easy win in that you've put something out there, but is it really a win in that, are you meeting kind of the more deeper objectives that you want to achieve with your storytelling? And to Abdul-Rehman's point, if storytelling should always be embedded in everything that you're doing. And so keeping that eye open at all times about the purpose of the stories that you're telling. What is it actually achieving? And if it's not achieving the core goals and it's just achieving kind of, okay, a post is out, then that's an easy win, but not a win. So I think that's something important to keep in mind. Thank you.
Anyone else want to go next?
I can go next. We have talked a lot about platforms. There are many platforms. We've just talked about stopping the scroll and that kind of thing. And there's much more to come. I think we're just saying, we're writing it and we'll see much, much more. I think for me, the biggest takeaway is the discipline. Just as Bhumika mentioned, the discipline to keep storytelling at the core and center, the discipline to keep it authentic, and to ensure that whatever we do, we have got their authenticity. You as a storyteller, you have to preserve yourself so that you don't lose yourself in the machinery of production. You have to feel the story. You have to come in contact with it. You have to be able to understand it and see, why has this actually resonated with me? And for that reason, it will resonate with somebody else. So I think that's very critical, so that we are also protecting that space for ourselves as the ones who are given the space to, and given the permission, so to speak, to enter into the space of others and carry their agency, carry their stories to a wider audience.
Mehmet?
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for giving us this space. I think what I'm taking from this panel is really a sense of solidarity with my fellow storytellers and everyone who's listening. I think we are in a very transformational moment in the world. I think we're up against a lot of difficult forces, both politically, but also just the technical developments, the rise of AI, the rise of misinformation, the way the algorithms dictate the ways in which we create content, but also consume content. So I think our work is really cut out for us. And I agree with my fellow panelists about, keeping up the authenticity and the personal value of what we're doing, protecting ourselves, and just really trying our best to elevate the human element in what we're trying to do towards a better world. Thank you all.
Thanks. I want to say playful. I heard a lot. Playful experimentation. And sometimes it's the stuff that we don't think is going to land that lands. And I love the tarot card, the climate change tarot cards. I love those, handing over content and not quite knowing what's going to happen. Bhumika, you told us that of having startups be storytellers and know that why someone is doing something. I think that playfulness. And that comes with a sense of serendipity, that comes with a sense of surprise, and then that opens doors, and that's what the algorithm can't do. That's what the algorithm can't predict. It can't predict human creativity, agency, and experience. Our human experience will always be the driver of human possibility, and I love this idea of leaning into playfulness. And Bhumika, I so resonate. The quick wins sometimes aren't wins, and so you got to take a chance and try stuff. So thank you. I also want to thank you, Nicholas, for convening us, and Grace, Bhumika, and Mehmet. What an honor to be with all of you. I look forward to staying in touch and finding ways that we can, as you said, Mehmet, we can shift things a little bit together.
Definitely. And listen, thank you very much for joining. I think it's only the beginning of the conversation, as you said, Abdul-Rehman, and so I'll try to find ways in which we can continue this conversation. I'll of course be sending the recording and a summary via email to everyone, and then hopefully we can learn from each other and really develop something that is gonna really as we said, keep storytelling on the agenda, and really do something that is going to have an impact. So thank you very much for all of you that have joined, and we'll definitely be in touch very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for joining.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.